This is part 3 of J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. This section is regarding fantasy. The human mind is capable of forming mental images of things not actually present. The faculty of conceiving the image is or was naturally called imagination. But in recent times, in technical, not normal language, imagination has often been held to be something higher than the mere image-making, ascribed to the operations of fancy, a reduced and depreciatory form of the older word fantasy. An attempt is thus made to restrict, I should say misapply, imagination to, quote, the power of giving to ideal creations the inner consistency of reality. Ridiculous though it may be for one so ill-instructed to have an opinion on this critical matter, I venture to think the verbal distinction philologically inappropriate, and the analysis inaccurate. The mental power of image-making is one thing, or aspect, and it should appropriately be called imagination. The perception of the image, the grasp of its implications, and the control, which are necessary to a successful expression, may vary in vividness and strength, but this is a difference in degree of imagination, not a difference in kind. The achievement of the expression, which gives or seems to give the inner consistency of reality, is indeed another thing, or aspect, needing another name. Art, the operative link between imagination and the final result, subcreation. For my present purpose, I require a word which shall embrace both the subcreative art in itself and a quality of strangeness and wonder in the expression, derived from the image, a quality essential to fairy stories. I propose, therefore, to aggregate to myself the powers of Humpty Dumpty, and to use fantasy for this purpose, in a sense, that is, which combines with its older and higher use as an equivalent of imagination the derived notions of unreality, that is, of unlikeness to the primary world, of freedom from the domination of observed fact, in short, of the fantastic. I am thus not only aware but glad of the etymological and semantic connections of fantasy with fantastic, with images of things that are not only not actually present, but which are indeed not to be found in our primary world at all, or are generally believed not to be found there. But while admitting that, I do not assent to the depreciative tone, that the images are of things not in the primary world, if indeed that is possible, is a virtue, not a vice. Fantasy, in this sense, I think, is not a lower but a higher form of art, indeed the most nearly pure form, and so, when achieved, the most potent. Fantasy, of course, starts with an advantage, arresting strangeness. But that advantage has been turned against it, and has contributed to its disrepute. Many people dislike being arrested. They dislike any meddling with the primary world, or such small glimpses of it as are familiar to them. They therefore stupidly and even maliciously confound fantasy with dreaming, in which there is no art, and with mental disorders, in which there is not even control, with delusion and hallucination. But the error or malice engendered by disquiet and consequent dislike is not the only cause of this confusion. Fantasy has also an essential drawback. It is difficult to achieve. Fantasy may be, as I think, not less but more subcreative, but at any rate, it is found in practice that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce, the more unlike are the images and the rearrangements of primary material to the actual arrangements of the primary world. It is easier to produce this kind of, quote, reality with more sober material. Fantasy, thus, too often remains undeveloped. It is, and has been used frivolously, or only half seriously, or merely for decoration. It remains merely fanciful. Anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say, "the green sun." Many can then imagine or picture it. But that is not enough, though it may already be a more potent thing than many a thumbnail sketch or transcript of life that receives literary praise. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted, and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art. Indeed, narrative art. Story-making in its primary and most potent mode. In human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. In painting, for instance, the visible presentation of the fantastic image is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. Silliness or morbidity are frequent results. It is a misfortune that drama, an art fundamentally distinct from literature, should so commonly be considered together with it, or as a branch of it. Among these misfortunes we may reckon the depreciation of fantasy. For, in part at least, this depreciation is due to the natural desire of critics to cry up the forms of literature or imagination that they themselves, innately or by training, prefer. And criticism in a country that has produced so great a drama, and possesses the works of William Shakespeare, tends to be far too dramatic. But drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Fantasy, even of the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama, when that is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted. Fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. Men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they do not achieve fantasy. This is, I think, well illustrated by the failure of the bastard form, pantomime. The nearer it is to dramatized fairy story, the worse it is. It is only tolerable when the plot and its fantasy are reduced to a mere vestigiary framework for farce, and no belief of any kind in any part of the performance is required or expected of anybody. This is, of course, partly due to the fact that the producers of drama have to, or try to, work with mechanism to represent either fantasy or magic. I once saw a so-called children's pantomime, the straight story of Puss in Boots, with even the metamorphosis of the ogre into a mouse. Had this been mechanically successful, it would have either terrified the spectators or else have just been a turn of high-class conjuring. As it was, though done with some ingenuity of lighting, disbelief had not so much to be suspended as hanged, drawn, and quartered. In Macbeth, when it is read, I find the witches tolerable. They have a narrative function and some hint of dark significance, though they are vulgarized poor things of their kind. They are almost intolerable in the play. They would be quite intolerable if I were not fortified by some memory of them as they are in the story that I read. I am told that I should feel differently if I had the mind of the period, with its witch hunts and witch trials. But that is to say, if I regarded the witches as possible, indeed likely, in the primary world. In other words, if they ceased to be fantasy. That argument concedes the point. To be dissolved or to be degraded is the likely fate of fantasy when the dramatist tries to use it, even such a dramatist as Shakespeare. Macbeth is indeed a work by a playwright who ought, at least on this occasion, to have written a story, if he had the skill or patience for that art. A reason more important, I think, than the inadequacy of stage effects is this. Drama has, of its very nature, already attempted a kind of bogus, or shall I say at least substitute, magic. The visible and audible presentation of imaginary men in a story. That is in itself an attempt to counterfeit the magician's wand, to introduce, with even mechanical success, into this quasi-magical secondary world, a further fantasy or magic, is to demand, as it were, an inner or tertiary world. It is a world too much. To make such a thing may not be impossible. I have never seen it done with success. But at least it cannot be claimed as the proper mode of drama, in which walking and talking people have been found to be the natural instruments of art and illusion. For this precise reason, that the characters and even the scenes are in drama not imagined but actually beheld, drama is, even though it uses a similar material, words, verse, plot, an art fundamentally different from narrative art. Thus, if you prefer drama to literature, as many literary critics plainly do, or form your critical theories primarily from dramatic critics, or even from drama, you are apt to misunderstand pure story-making, and to constrain it to the limitations of stage plays. You are, for instance, likely to prefer characters, even the basest and dullest, to things. Very little about trees as trees can be got into a play. Now, a fairy in drama, those plays which, according to abundant records, the elves have often presented to men, can produce fantasy with a realism and immediacy beyond the compass of any human mechanism. As a result, their usual effect upon a man is to go beyond secondary belief. If you are present at a fairy in drama, you are yourself, or that you think you are, bodily inside its secondary world. The experience may be very similar to dreaming, and has, it would seem sometimes by men, been confounded with it. But in fairy and drama, you are in a dream that some other mind is weaving, and the knowledge of that alarming fact may slip from your grasp. To experience directly a secondary world, the potion is too strong, and you give it to primary belief, however marvelous the events. You are deluded. Whether that is the intention of the elves, always or at any time, is another question. They, at any rate, are not themselves deluded. This is for them a form of art, and distinct from wizardry or magic, properly so called. They do not live in it, though they can, perhaps, afford to spend more time at it than human artists can. The primary world, reality, of elves and men is the same, if differently valued and perceived. We need a word for this elvish craft. But all the words that have been applied to it have been blurred and confused with other things. Magic is ready to hand, and I have used it above, but I should not have done so. Magic should be reserved for the operations of the magician. Art is the human process that produces, by the way, it is not its only or ultimate object, secondary belief. Art is art of the same sort, if more skilled and effortless, the elves can use also, or so the reports seem to show. But the more potent and specially elvish craft I will, for lack of a less debatable word, call enchantment. Enchantment produces a secondary world, into which both designer and spectator can enter, to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside. But, in its purity, it is artistic in desire and purpose. Magic produces, or pretends to produce, an alteration in the primary world. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal, it remains distinct from the other two. It is not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. To the elvish craft, enchantment, fantasy aspires, and when it is successful, of all forms of human art most nearly approaches. At the heart of many man-made stories of elves lies, open or concealed, pure or alloyed, the desire for a living, realized, sub-creative art, which, however much it may outwardly resemble it, is inwardly wholly different from the greed for self-centered power which is the mark of the mere magician. Of this desire the elves, in their better, but still perilous part, are largely made. And it is from them that we may learn what is the central desire and aspiration of human fantasy, even if the elves are, all the more so insofar as they are, only a product of fantasy itself. That creative desire is only cheated by counterfeits, whether the innocent but clumsy devices of the human dramatist, or the malevolent frauds of the magicians. In this world, it is for men unsatisfiable, and so imperishable. Uncorrupted, it does not seek delusion, nor bewitchment and domination. It seeks shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves. To many, fantasy, this subcreative art which plays strange tricks with the world and all that is in it, combining nouns and redistributing adjectives, has seemed suspect, if not illegitimate. To some, it has seemed at least childish folly, a thing only for persons or for people in their youth. As for its legitimacy, I will say no more than to quote a brief passage from a letter I once wrote to a man who described myth and fairy stories as lies. Though, to do him justice, he was kind enough and confused enough to call fairy story making breathing a lie through silver. "Dear sir," I said, "although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. That right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made." Fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not either blunt the appetite for, nor obscure the perception of, scientific verity. On the contrary, the keener and the clearer is the reason, the better fantasy will it make. If men were ever in a state in which they did not want to know or could not perceive truth, facts, or evidence, then fantasy would languish until they were cured. If they ever got into that state, it would not seem at all impossible, fantasy would perish and become morbid delusion. For creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, not a slavery to it. So upon logic was founded the nonsense that displays itself in the tales and rhymes of Lewis Carroll. If men really could not distinguish between frogs and men, fairy stories about frog kings would not have arisen. Fantasy can, of course, be carried to excess. It can be ill done. It can be put to evil uses. It may even delude the minds out of which it came. But of what human thing in this fallen world is that not true? Men have conceived not only of elves, but they have imagined gods, and worshipped them, even worshipped those most deformed by their author's own evil. But they have made false gods out of other materials. Their notions, their banners, their monies, even their sciences and their social and economic theories have demanded human sacrifice. Abusus non tollit usum. Fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. This ends part 3 of Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. Thank you for watching.